My mother-in-law stood at the foot of my hospital bed, looked at the two newborn twins in my arms, and handed my husband a black travel bag. She leaned in close and whispered, "Run before those babies ruin you." And he did. He turned his back on his own children and walked out the door. Years later, my husband would see my face on national television. He would sit in his mother's living room and watch as a talk show host exposed every lie they had built their lives upon. But the real shock came when the host held up a single piece of paper and read my final letter aloud to millions of viewers. That was the exact moment my mother-in-law's smug smile permanently vanished. Before I tell you what that letter said and how I took back everything they stole from me, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Let me know where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. I would love to hear from you. My name is Sarah. I am 31 years old and I work as a tax accountant. But 4 years ago, I was just a terrified young mother lying in a sterile hospital recovery room. The steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality. My chest felt heavy. The sting of the emergency cesarean section radiated across my abdomen, a sharp, burning reminder of the grueling 20-hour labor I had just endured. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the suffocating silence in that room. I held my two newborn babies, a boy and a girl, one in each arm. They were so small, wrapped tightly in those striped hospital blankets, their tiny chests rising and falling against mine. I looked up, desperate for a reassuring glance from the man who had promised to be my partner in all things. David was standing by the door. He did not look at me. He did not look at the children we had prayed for. His eyes were fixed entirely on the woman standing beside him, his mother, Patricia. Patricia wore a crisp, immaculate beige suit, her hair perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. She looked completely out of place in the messy emotional reality of a maternity ward. She held a black leather travel bag in her right hand. I recognized it immediately. It was the expensive overnight bag David used for business trips. In her left hand, she held a printed piece of paper. I tried to speak, but my throat was painfully dry. "David," I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the sound of the heart monitor. "Come meet them." He shifted his weight, his shoulders tense, but he did not move toward the bed. Instead, he looked at Patricia like a little boy waiting for permission to speak. Patricia stepped forward, but not to admire her grandchildren. She completely ignored the two fragile lives resting against my chest. She shoved the black travel bag into David's chest. Then she pressed the printed paper into his palm. It was a boarding pass, a one-way plane ticket. She leaned in close to his ear, but in the quiet of the hospital room, her whisper was entirely deliberate. She wanted me to hear every single word. "Go now, David," she hissed, her tone laced with absolute authority. "Go before this burden ruins your future at the family business." I blinked, the exhaustion of surgery making my brain slow to process the cruelty of her words. A burden? She was calling her own grandchildren a burden. She was calling me a burden. I stared at David, waiting for the anger to rise in him. I waited for the man I married to drop the bag, tear up the ticket, and tell his mother to get out of our hospital room. I waited for him to walk over to the bed, kiss my forehead, and tell me everything was going to be okay. Instead, David looked down at the boarding pass. His face was a mask of sheer panic and cowardly resignation. In that single devastating moment, the past 5 years of my life flashed before my eyes, suddenly cast in a harsh, unforgiving light. I had met David when I was 22, freshly graduated, and building a solid career as a junior tax accountant at a reputable firm in Chicago. I had ambition. I had a clear path. But David was charming, persistent, and he promised me a partnership built on absolute trust. When we stood at the altar at St. Paul's Church, he looked me in the eyes and promised to love me in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. I believed him completely. I believed him so much that when his family's real estate business hit a rough patch, I agreed to step back from my demanding accounting firm. I took a massive pay cut to do freelance bookkeeping from home, sacrificing my own career trajectory so I could be available to manage his schedule, run his household, and support his ambitions. I poured every ounce of my energy into being the perfect wife, the perfect support system, the solid ground he could stand on. But the moment we discovered we were having twins, the ground shifted. The financial pressure of preparing for two babies sent David into a spiral. Rather than stepping up, rather than sitting down with me to make a budget and a plan, he retreated. He began spending more time at his mother's house. He stopped answering my questions about our savings. He shrank away from the responsibility of fatherhood before the babies were even born. And now, standing in this hospital room, the truth was undeniable. David was not a partner. He was just a boy hiding behind his mother's skirt. Patricia had never liked me. She had always thought I was too independent, too practical, too middle class for her precious son. She saw the twins not as a blessing, but as a financial anchor that would drag her son away from her control. David finally looked at me. His eyes were completely empty of the love he had sworn at St. Paul's. "Sarah, I am sorry," he mumbled, his voice trembling and weak. "I just cannot do this right now. It is too much. I need space. Space." I repeated the word, feeling it scrape against my dry throat. "David, we just had two babies. I just had major surgery. You cannot leave us here." He took a step backward toward the hallway. Patricia placed a protective, possessive hand on his arm, steering him toward the exit. "Do not make this harder than it has to be," Sarah Patricia said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "David needs to focus on the business. He cannot be tied down by all of this right now. You are a smart girl. You will figure it out." I tried to sit up, a sharp jolt of pain tearing through my abdomen, forcing me back against the pillows. The baby stirred, letting out soft, fragile cries. I clutched them tighter to my chest. "David, do not walk out that door," I pleaded. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was a desperate command. "If you walk out that door right now, do not ever come back." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but Patricia gave his arm a firm tug. "Let us go, David," she commanded. He turned his back on me. He turned his back on his newborn son and daughter. And without another word, he walked out the door, the black travel bag swinging from his shoulder. Patricia followed right behind him, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, a rhythmic, steady sound of abandonment that echoed down the hospital hallway until there was nothing left but silence. I lay there for a long time, paralyzed by a mixture of heavy narcotics and absolute disbelief. The room felt incredibly cold. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a sterile glare over the empty space where my husband had just stood. I looked down at the two tiny faces resting against me. My son had a small, perfect, long nose. My daughter was making tiny, soft sounds, seeking warmth. They were completely helpless, entirely dependent on a father who had just boarded a flight to nowhere, and a mother who was broken, bleeding, and entirely alone. Tears finally spilled over my cheeks, hot and fast. They ran down my face and soaked into the hospital gown. I cried for the marriage I thought I had. I cried for the 5 years of my youth I had freely given to a man who discarded me the moment life became difficult. But most of all, I cried for my children, who had been abandoned before they even opened their eyes to see the world. A nurse walked in a few minutes later to check my vitals. She smiled brightly, oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just collapsed. "How are we doing, Mom?" she asked, cheerfully, checking the IV line connected to my wrist. "Where did Dad run off to? Did he go grab some coffee?" "He had to leave," I said. My voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. "Well, you just get some rest," she said, adjusting the blankets around the twins. "You have two beautiful, healthy babies here. That is all that matters." She was right. They were all that mattered. As I held them, feeling their tiny heartbeats against my own, a profound shift happened inside me. The despair began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I was a tax accountant. I knew how to survive. I knew how to manage deficits and rebuild ledgers. I had spent my life organizing chaos into order. If David wanted to run, let him run. I would rebuild my life without him. I would provide for my children. I did not need a coward to help me raise them. 3 days later, the hospital staff informed me I was cleared for discharge. The physical pain of the surgery was still sharp, but I had learned to navigate it, moving carefully as I packed the small bag of items I had brought with me. A social worker helped me arrange transport, and a kind nurse wheeled me down to the billing department to finalize the paperwork. I approached the billing desk with the twins secured in a double stroller beside me. The clerk smiled and handed me the final invoice. Even after our insurance coverage, the remaining balance for the emergency surgery and the extended hospital stay was significant. But I was not worried. I had an emergency savings fund in a joint account that I had meticulously built from my freelance accounting work over the past 3 years. I pulled my debit card from my wallet and handed it to the clerk. She swiped the card through the machine. She frowned slightly and swiped it again. "I am sorry, ma'am," she said, looking up at me with a polite but apologetic expression. "The card is being declined." "Declined?" I asked, confused. "That is impossible. Please try it again. There should be plenty of funds in that account. It is my main savings." She typed the numbers manually into her keyboard, her brow furrowing. "I am really sorry. The system is showing that the account has been frozen and this specific card has been deactivated. Do you have another form of payment?" A cold chill washed over me, starting at the base of my neck and creeping all the way down to my fingertips. My hands began to shake. The joint account. The account I had poured my sweat and tears into. The account Patricia had insisted David's name remain on as the primary holder for tax purposes. I pulled out my phone and quickly logged into my mobile banking app. The screen loaded and the numbers stared back at me in cruel digital clarity. The balance in our joint savings account was zero. Every single dollar had been transferred out 2 days ago. And below that, a bright red notification indicated that my access to the credit line had been permanently revoked by the primary account holder. I thought being abandoned by my husband at the hospital was the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to a person. But staring at that zero balance, the realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. David had not just left me, he and Patricia had stripped me of every resource I had. I managed to set up a payment plan with the hospital billing department using the last $300 of cash I had in my personal checking account as a good faith deposit. I loaded the twins into a taxi and gave the driver the address to the upscale suburban apartment David and I had shared. The entire ride home, my mind raced. I just needed to get inside. I needed to get to my desktop computer, my physical client files, my personal documents. If I could just get to my work, I could start generating income immediately. The taxi pulled up to the familiar brick building. I carefully carried the double car seat up the walkway to the front entrance. I reached into my purse, pulled out my brass key, and slid it into the lock of our front door. The key went halfway in and stopped. I jiggled it, pushing harder, but it refused to turn. I pulled it out and tried again, panic rising in my throat. It did not fit. The lock had been changed. Suddenly, the door swung open from the inside. But it was not David standing there. It was the building manager holding a clipboard and looking at me with deep discomfort. He handed me a crisp white piece of paper. "I am so sorry, Sarah," he said quietly, "but Patricia owns this unit, and she terminated your lease agreement yesterday. You have to leave." I stood on the porch in the freezing rain holding 2 newborn babies completely locked out of my own life, realizing that a much larger, far more sinister problem was waiting for me in the shadows. The building manager stood in the doorway of the apartment I had called home for the last 4 years. His name was Mr. Henderson. He was a kind man, usually the sort who would hold the elevator for you or ask about your day. But right now, he could not meet my eyes. He looked down at his clipboard, shifting his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He extended a crisp white envelope toward me. I stood there on the covered porch, the freezing Chicago rain pouring down just inches away, holding a heavy double car seat with 2 sleeping infants inside. I asked him what this was. I told him I just needed to get inside to put the babies down, to get my dry clothes, to grab my accounting files. We owned this place, I explained to him. I reminded him that just last summer, David and I had spent 3 weeks picking out the new hardwood floors. I reminded him that I had paid for the custom kitchen cabinets using the money I earned from my freelance tax preparation business. Mr. Henderson finally looked up at me. His expression was full of pity, which was somehow worse than malice. He spoke quietly, telling me that he was incredibly sorry, but Patricia owned this unit. Her name was the only one on the property deed. He told me she had formally terminated my lease agreement that very morning and had instructed building security to change the locks. The words did not make sense at first. I felt a sudden ringing in my ears. I am a tax accountant. I spend my days tracking assets, liabilities, and legal ownership. How could I have been so blind to my own life? Then the memory hit me with sickening clarity. Years ago, when we first moved in, David had convinced me that keeping the property exclusively in his mother's name was a brilliant strategy to avoid certain property tax liabilities while his business was getting off the ground. He had kissed my forehead, and told me it was just temporary paperwork. He said what was his was mine. I had trusted him completely. I had let my love for my husband override my professional instincts. I had essentially paid out of my own pocket to upgrade a luxury apartment for my mother-in-law, leaving myself with absolutely zero legal claim to the property. I asked Mr. Henderson about my belongings, my clothes, the baby's cribs, my personal documents. He told me Patricia had hired a moving company yesterday while I was in the hospital recovering from my cesarean section. Everything I owned had been packed into boxes and shipped to a cheap storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Patricia had left only one small cardboard box on the porch for me. Inside was my work laptop, a single package of newborn diapers, and a change of clothes. She had meticulously calculated exactly how to strip my life down to the studs while making sure she kept everything of value. I did not argue with Mr. Henderson. There was no point. He was just a man doing his job. I turned around, picked up the heavy double car seat, and walked out into the pouring rain. The walk to my car felt like a miserable eternity. The icy rain sliced through my thin hospital clothes, soaking me to the bone. Every step sent a sharp, burning jolt of pain radiating from my surgical incision, but I forced myself to keep moving. I reached my 10-year-old Ford sedan, the same unreliable car Patricia had constantly mocked because it looked so out of place, parked next to their luxury vehicles. I secured the babies into the back seat, making sure they were covered and warm. Then I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut against the storm. The interior of the old Ford was freezing. The air smelled of damp upholstery and old coffee. I started the engine and turned the heater up as high as it would go. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically back and forth, pushing away the heavy sheets of water. I sat there, with my hands gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I pulled my phone from my damp pocket and opened my banking app one more time. I needed to see it again to believe it was real. My personal checking account balance stared back at me in bright digital numbers. $312. That was it. That was my entire net worth. 5 years of unwavering loyalty, 5 years of putting my own career on hold, 5 years of sacrificing my youth to build up a man who claimed to love me unconditionally. And all I had to show for it was $300, an old car, and 2 newborn babies sitting in the back seat. I looked at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I expected to see a shattered woman. I expected to see someone crying uncontrollably, begging the universe for mercy. But my eyes were completely dry. I stared at myself, and I realized something profound. Tears were useless right now. Tears could not buy baby formula. Tears could not buy diapers. Crying would not put gas in my car or a roof over my children's heads. In that freezing, cramped car, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, my entire worldview shifted. The naive, trusting girl who believed that love and sacrifice would always be rewarded was dead. She had died on the operating table while her husband planned his escape. The absolute betrayal I had just experienced burned away every ounce of my sadness, leaving behind nothing but a cold, calculating instinct for survival. My unwavering faith in that family had been crushed to ashes, but from those ashes an incredible sense of clarity emerged. I realized I was entirely on my own, and surprisingly, that thought did not terrify me anymore. It liberated me. I did not need a cowardly husband or a manipulative mother-in-law to survive. I was a professional. I knew how to manage deficits. I knew how to rebuild from nothing. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the luxury apartment complex without looking back. I needed a safe harbor for the night. I drove across town to the modest duplex of my oldest friend, Jessica. Jessica and I had known each other since college. She was a middle school teacher, a woman who lived simply but loved fiercely. When I knocked on her door, shivering and soaking wet, carrying 2 newborn babies in a double car seat, she did not ask a single question. She took one look at my pale face and pulled us inside out of the storm. Jessica wrapped me in warm blankets, made me hot tea, and helped me feed the twins. She set up a safe space for them to sleep in her living room. When I finally told her what David and Patricia had done, she sat beside me on her worn fabric sofa, her face tight with anger. She offered to call the police. She offered to drive over to Patricia's house and demand answers, but I shook my head. I told her that reacting with blind anger was exactly what Patricia wanted. Patricia had all the money, all the power, and all the legal leverage. If I caused a scene, she would use her expensive lawyers to paint me as an unstable, hysterical mother. She could even try to take the twins away from me just out of spite. I told Jessica I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be quiet, invisible, and strategic. I finally fell asleep on Jessica's pull-out couch just before dawn, my body absolutely exhausted, but my mind racing with plans for the future. When I woke up the next morning, the storm had passed, and pale sunlight was streaming through the living room blinds. The twins were still sleeping soundly in their makeshift beds. I knew I had an incredibly narrow window of time to secure my footing. I needed to generate income immediately to find a permanent place to live and to hire legal counsel. I walked over to the dining table and unboxed the work laptop Patricia had left on the porch. It was a silver machine slightly dented on one corner, but it was my most valuable tool. I powered it on and connected to Jessica's internet network. My initial plan was simple. I was going to email every single one of my former tax accounting clients. I was going to tell them I was officially launching my own independent financial consulting firm and ask if they needed immediate bookkeeping or tax preparation services. I knew my work was flawless, and I was confident I could pull together enough retainer fees within a week to secure a cheap apartment. I opened my web browser ready to log into my professional email, but when the browser loaded, a different inbox appeared on the screen. David had borrowed my laptop occasionally over the past year whenever his own computer was running slow. He was notoriously careless with his digital security, always forgetting to log out of his accounts. The browser had automatically opened to a secondary email account. He rarely used a generic address. He kept mostly for junk mail and online subscriptions. My first instinct was to simply log out. I did not care what marketing emails or spam newsletters he was receiving. But as my finger moved the cursor toward the sign out button, my eyes caught a specific folder sitting in the sidebar, the navigation menu. The folder was labeled Legal Preparations. I stopped breathing. The cursor hovered over the screen. A strange, heavy silence filled the room. I clicked on the folder. Inside were dozens of email threads. I looked at the timestamps. They were not from yesterday. They were not from the day I went into the hospital to deliver our babies. The dates stretched back exactly 7 months. They started the exact same week David and I had sat in the doctor's office and seen 2 tiny heartbeats on the ultrasound monitor. My hands began to tremble as I opened the very first email in the chain. It was a message sent directly from Patricia to David with an email address ending in a prestigious law firm's domain name copied on the thread. I read the words on the screen, and the last remnants of my broken heart turned to solid ice. Patricia had written in clear, concise language. She instructed David to begin slowly moving assets out of their joint accounts. She advised him to feign financial stress to justify delaying any major purchases for the nursery. She specifically mentioned ensuring that my name was removed from any residual property documents under the guise of protecting me from the business liabilities. This was not a sudden panic attack. David had not been overwhelmed by the sudden reality of new fatherhood. His departure at the hospital was not a moment of weakness or a tragic emotional breakdown. It was a meticulous, cold-blooded, and entirely premeditated plot. They had spent the last 7 months smiling at me, watching my stomach grow, listening to me talk about names for the babies, all while secretly dismantling my entire life behind my back. They had carefully orchestrated every single detail to ensure that the moment I gave birth, I would be stripped of every asset, locked out of my home, and left completely destitute, while David walked away with his wealth and freedom perfectly intact. I sat staring at the glowing screen, the depth of their cruelty fully washing over me. I had thought I was married to a coward. I realized now I had been married to a monster raised by an even bigger monster. But as I read through the emails downloading and saving every single piece of correspondence to an external hard drive, a dangerous realization began to form in my mind. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought because I was quiet and accommodating, I would just disappear into poverty and never challenge them. They severely underestimated the woman they had crossed. They had left me with nothing but my brain, my accounting skills, and my fierce love for my children. And they had just handed me the exact blueprint of their entire conspiracy. I closed the laptop, my mind already working through the calculations of my revenge. Patricia and David thought the game was over. They had no idea it was only just beginning, and I was going to tear their empire down brick by brick. 4 years passed. That is the thing about hitting rock bottom. The world does not stop spinning just because your heart is broken. You do not get a pause button to grieve the life you lost. You just have to wake up the next morning and figure out how to feed your children. I moved out of Jessica's living room as soon as I secured a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet working-class neighborhood. It was not the luxury condo with custom hardwood floors that Patricia had stolen from me. The carpet was worn and the heating radiator clanked loudly in the winter. But my name was on the lease. It was mine, and no one could ever change the locks on me again. To keep that roof over our heads, I built a life out of pure exhaustion and sheer willpower. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously. My day started at 4 in the morning. While the twins Leo and Mia were still fast asleep in their shared crib, I would sit at a small folding table in the kitchen, drinking black coffee and working on my freelance bookkeeping business. I reconciled accounts for small local businesses, plumbing companies, bakeries, and independent contractors. I worked until 7, then got the babies dressed, fed, and dropped off at a subsidized daycare center run by a kind older woman named Mrs. Higgins. From 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon during tax season and the months surrounding it, I worked as a part-time tax preparer at a mid-sized accounting firm downtown. I sat in a cubicle crunching numbers, finding deductions for families and small corporations, applying every ounce of the financial expertise I possessed. Then I would rush to pick up the twins, bring them home, feed them dinner, bathe them, and put them to bed by 7 in the evening. But my day was not over. At 8 at night, a neighbor, a retired nurse who understood the struggles of a single mother, would come over to sit on my couch and knit while the twins slept. I would put on a blue uniform vest and drive to a local grocery store to work the night shift as a cashier until midnight. I scanned barcodes, bagged groceries, and smiled at customers while my feet throbbed and my eyes burned with fatigue. I averaged 4 hours of sleep a night for 4 straight years. I never complained, not once. When my legs ached so badly I could barely walk up the stairs to my apartment, I thought about David walking out of that hospital room. When I had to skip a meal so I could afford a better brand of baby formula for Leo and Mia, I thought about Patricia sneering at me and calling my children a burden. My anger was gone. It had burned away completely, leaving behind a cold, indestructible engine of determination. I was surviving. My children were thriving. They were happy, healthy, and safe. I had rebuilt my entire existence from absolute scratch, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. I believed the worst of my past was firmly behind me. I thought David and Patricia had simply erased me from their lives and moved on to whatever shallow, miserable existence they deserved. I had no idea that they had left a financial time bomb ticking quietly in the background, waiting to detonate and destroy the fragile peace I had fought so hard to build. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early April. It was the peak of tax season. The accounting firm where I worked part-time was a chaotic blur of ringing phones, stressed clients, and overflowing file cabinets. I was sitting in my cubicle, staring at 2 computer monitors, surrounded by stacks of tax forms, profit and loss statements, and expense receipts. I was finalizing a complex corporate tax return for a long-time client. The office was stuffy, smelling of old coffee and printer toner. I was exhausted, running on empty after a grueling shift at the grocery store the night before, but my focus was razor sharp. I pride myself on being meticulous. In the accounting world, a single misplaced decimal point or a forgotten signature can trigger a massive audit. I triple-checked the clients. Federal tax withholdings, ensured their quarterly payments were properly applied, and prepared to submit the return electronically through the secure portal connected directly to the Internal Revenue Service. As a certified tax preparer, part of the submission protocol requires me to enter my own preparer tax identification number and my social security number to verify my credentials and authorize the electronic filing. It was a routine step. I had done it thousands of times before without a second thought. I typed in my credentials, clicked the submit button, and took a sip of my lukewarm coffee, waiting for the green confirmation screen to appear. Instead, the screen froze for a moment. Then a harsh red error message flashed across the monitor. Submission rejected. Preparer credentials invalid. Federal tax lien flag. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen. I set my coffee mug down so quickly it spilled over the edge of the desk. I wiped the screen thinking it was a system glitch. The Internal Revenue Service portals were known to crash or display errors during the heavy traffic of April. I refreshed the page, cleared the cache, and carefully retyped my social security number, making sure every digit was absolutely correct. I clicked submit again. The exact same red error message appeared. Federal tax lien flag. Unpaid federal tax debt associated with this social security number. My heart performed a strange, heavy stutter in my chest. A federal tax lien. That meant the government believed I owed them a massive delinquent debt. A debt so severe, they had flagged my credentials and essentially suspended my ability to practice as a certified tax preparer. It meant they could seize my bank accounts. It meant they could garnish my wages. It meant the safety net I had spent 4 years building for my twins could be wiped out in an instant. I immediately logged into my personal Internal Revenue Service portal. I checked my filing history. I am a tax accountant. I pay my taxes religiously. Every single return I had filed for the past 4 years had been processed, accepted, and paid in full. I had 0 outstanding balances. I had never received a single notice of deficiency in the mail. I had no red flags on my personal credit report. This made absolutely no sense. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I knew from professional experience that when the government flags an account with a lien without prior warning, it usually means the debt is tied to something hidden. Something buried deep in a corporate structure or a secondary liability status that the primary taxpayer has ignored. I picked up my desk phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. I dialed the priority practitioner hotline for the Internal Revenue Service, a dedicated phone number available only to certified tax professionals. The automated voice thanked me for calling and placed me on a brief hold. The terrible elevator music playing through the receiver sounded like a countdown clock. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. I thought about the $300 I had started with 4 years ago. I thought about the nights I cried myself to sleep from the physical pain in my legs after standing at the cash register for hours. I thought about my beautiful twins, Leo and Mia, who were currently napping on their little cots at daycare, completely oblivious to the fact that our entire lives were suddenly dangling over a financial cliff. After 10 agonizing minutes, a human voice finally came on the line. The agent identified himself as Mr. Roberts from the Federal Collections Division. He asked for my practitioner number and my personal social security number to authenticate my identity. I rattled the numbers off my voice remarkably steady, despite the panic threatening to consume my mind. Mr. Roberts typed on his keyboard. The loud clicking echoed through the phone line. He asked me to confirm my current address and my date of birth. I answered every question precisely. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Sarah, Mr. Roberts finally said, his tone shifting from professional to gravely serious. I see why your submission was rejected today. Your social security number has been flagged by the automated collection system. You have an active federal tax lien placed on all your assets effective as of this morning. I gripped the telephone receiver so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mr. Roberts, I said, maintaining my professional composure. There must be a catastrophic error. I am an accountant. I have filed every tax return on time. I do not owe any personal income taxes. I have the transcripts right in front of me. He sighed, the sound of a man who deals with financial disasters every day. This is not about your personal income tax return, Sarah. This lien is associated with a commercial default. You are listed as the primary financial guarantor on a defaulted corporate business loan. The business in question failed to pay federal payroll taxes and corporate income taxes for 3 consecutive years. The primary borrower defaulted on the loan, and the corporate entity was dissolved in bankruptcy court 6 months ago. Because the federal tax debt was secured by the business loan, the liability has legally bypassed the corporate shield. It has fallen directly onto the guarantor. The walls of my cubicle seemed to close in around me. The air in the room grew suddenly thin. A business loan. I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. What business? What are you talking about? I do not own a business. I have never guaranteed a commercial loan in my entire life. Mr. Roberts typed again. The business is registered under the name Vance Real Estate Developments. My stomach plummeted straight to the floor. Vance Real Estate Developments. That was Patricia's company. That was the family business David had abandoned me in the hospital to go protect. The business that was supposedly struggling right before I gave birth. How much I asked. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. How much is the defaulted loan? The original loan principal was $250,000. Mr. Roberts read directly from his screen. With the accumulated federal tax penalties, late fees, and compounded interest over the last 3 years, the total liability currently standing against your Social Security number is $312,450. I stopped breathing. $300,000. It was a death sentence. It was a financial execution. They could take my meager savings. They could garnish my wages from all 3 of my jobs. They could leave my children destitute. Mr. Roberts, I said, my voice rising in a desperate panic. I never signed for that loan. I never authorized anyone to use my name as a guarantor for Patricia Vance or David Vance. This is identity theft. This is massive financial fraud. You have to look at the origination documents. I am pulling up the digitized loan origination file right now, he said calmly. The documents show an electronic signature linked directly to your secure digital identity profile, matching your Social Security number and your previous residential address. The digital timestamp verifies that the electronic signature was executed and the guarantor agreement was legally bound on May 12th. 4 years ago, I sat frozen in my office chair. The entire world around me ceased to exist. The ringing phones, the chatter of my coworkers, the hum of the printer, everything vanished into a terrifying, suffocating void. May 12th, I did not need to check a calendar. I did not need to look at my records. That date was permanently burned into my soul. May 12th was the exact day I went into premature labor. It was the exact day I was rushed into an emergency operating room. It was the exact day the doctors administered a heavy spinal block, cutting me open to save the lives of my twin babies. While I was lying on an operating table, heavily sedated, partially comatose, and fighting to bring David's children into the world. He and his mother were not waiting anxiously in the hospital lobby. They were not praying for my survival. They were executing a carefully planned financial crime. They had accessed my digital credentials, forged my electronic signature, and legally bound me to a $250,000 corporate loan to save their failing business. They knew the company was going under. They knew the federal taxes were going unpaid. They needed a sacrificial lamb to take the devastating financial fall when the empire finally collapsed. They had completely ruined my life before they even walked into that hospital recovery room to hand David a travel bag and a one-way ticket. I hung up the phone with the Internal Revenue Service, staring blindly at my computer screen. My hands were perfectly still now. The shock had passed, replaced by something much darker and far more powerful. Patricia and David thought they had buried me alive. They thought I was just a naive, disposable girl who would quietly take the fall for their crimes. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They forced a tax accountant to look at their books, and I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury reserved for people who have a safety net to fall back on. When you are a single mother holding a federal tax lien notification with a balance of over $300,000, panic is a definitive death sentence. I hung up the phone with the Internal Revenue Service agent and sat perfectly still in my crowded office cubicle. The chaotic noise of the accounting firm around me faded into a dull, meaningless hum. I closed my eyes, took one deep breath, and mentally locked all of my immediate terror in a dark box. I was not a frightened, helpless 27-year-old girl recovering from surgery anymore. I was a 31-year-old seasoned tax professional. I knew exactly how to track capital. Money never actually disappears. It always leaves a permanent digital footprint. You just have to know which stones to overturn. I spent the next 4 hours utilizing every professional database I had access to. I pulled my comprehensive credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. I requested the public federal bankruptcy filings for Patricia and David's real estate development company. I paid the expensive access fees out of my own pocket, downloading hundreds of pages of corporate schedules, creditor lists, and historical disbursement records. The story that unfolded across those digitized pages was an absolute masterpiece of financial deception. Patricia had orchestrated a corporate bankruptcy that was so perfectly timed and flawlessly executed, it belonged in a university textbook for white-collar crime. But she had made one fatal error. She had severely underestimated the forensic accounting abilities of the woman she chose as her scapegoat. I scrutinized the loan origination documents with clinical precision. The $250,000 commercial loan was executed on May 12th. That was the exact day my twins were born. I looked closely at the electronic signature timestamp. It was registered at 2 in the afternoon. At 2 in the afternoon on that specific day, I was completely unconscious. I was heavily sedated from an emergency cesarean section fighting a dangerous drop in my blood pressure in a sterile operating room. Patricia had not just guessed my digital passwords. She had used my personal laptop. I remembered then with a sickening jolt of clarity that she had offered to pack my hospital bag when my water broke early that morning. She had taken my laptop directly from my home office desk, knowing my digital signature credentials and my social security number were saved in my secure browser for my freelance bookkeeping work. She sat in the waiting room of the maternity ward, logged into my computer, and legally bound me to $250,000 in toxic corporate debt while I was bleeding on a surgical table just down the hall. But why? That was the central question that kept echoing loudly in my mind. Why take out a massive commercial loan for a real estate company that was already drowning in unpaid federal taxes and outstanding vendor debts? The company was bleeding capital long before I ever got pregnant. A $250,000 loan would not save a sinking ship of that massive size. It was a mere drop in the ocean of their liabilities. So I followed the cash. Using my skills as a seasoned auditor, I traced the exact disbursement of the loan funds listed in the bankruptcy schedules. The regional bank deposited the $250,000 into the real estate company account on May 13th. On May 14th, the entire amount was transferred out. It was not paid to the Internal Revenue Service to cover their delinquent taxes. It was not paid to their struggling contractors or local suppliers. It was categorized on the ledger as an executive consulting fee and wired immediately to an unknown third-party vendor. I aggressively traced that vendor. It was an anonymous shell corporation registered in the state of Delaware. From Delaware, the funds were almost immediately wired to an offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. It took me a full week of digging through international corporate registries and leveraging professional favors from old colleagues in corporate law to finally pierce through the shell company veil. When I finally found the ultimate beneficiary of that offshore trust account, my blood ran completely cold. The trust was not in Patricia's name. The irrevocable offshore trust had been established exclusively for the benefit of David. It was completely shielded from any domestic legal action, utterly invisible to standard marital asset division laws, and completely immune to any child support claims. The gravity of what I had just discovered hit me so hard I physically gasped for air. I pushed myself away from my desk, my hands covering my mouth in pure shock. All this time, for 4 grueling, exhausting years, I had genuinely believed David left me because he was a weak coward. I thought the daunting prospect of raising twin babies had simply overwhelmed his fragile, immature ego. I thought Patricia had just bullied him into running away to save him from the heavy responsibility of fatherhood. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. David did not leave because he was afraid of dirty diapers and late-night feedings. He left because the financial heist was finally complete. If David had stayed married to me, he would have been legally tethered to the massive financial ruin Patricia had just orchestrated. If we had remained together, my crushing federal debt would have instantly become his problem. By abandoning me in the hospital and filing for a swift, quiet divorce in a completely different legal jurisdiction shortly afterward, he permanently severed his legal liability. He walked away completely clean. He left me behind to absorb the catastrophic federal tax lien while he sat comfortably on $250,000 of stolen cash, safely tucked away in a tropical tax haven where no family court judge in America could ever touch it. The black travel bag his mother had handed him in the recovery room was not just packed with a change of clothes. It was the physical symbol of his complete financial escape. He had looked directly at his newborn son and daughter, knowing full well he was condemning their mother to a life of absolute poverty, and he willingly walked out the door anyway. My immediate blinding impulse was to reach for my desk phone and dial the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This was textbook wire fraud. This was aggravated identity theft. This was massive federal tax evasion. I wanted to see Patricia dragged out of her immaculate suburban home in heavy handcuffs. I wanted to see David stripped of his stolen offshore wealth and thrown into a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. I had the printed documents right in front of me. I had the digital timestamps, the routing numbers, the fraudulent bankruptcy schedules. I had the absolute undeniable proof of their sinister conspiracy. My finger hovered dangerously over the keypad of my phone. The urge for immediate aggressive retribution was a physical fire burning intensely in my chest. I wanted them to hurt the way my feet hurt every single night after standing at a grocery store cash register for 8 long hours. But then I forced myself to stop. I forced my breathing to slow down. I forced myself to think like the seasoned calculating accountant I had become rather than the betrayed broken wife I used to be. I looked closely at the harsh reality of the American justice system. If I filed a police report or initiated a massive civil lawsuit right now, I would be walking into a brutal war zone completely unarmed. Patricia was not just a wealthy suburban housewife. She was the highly influential president of her elite neighborhood homeowners association. She sat on the primary finance committee of the largest, wealthiest mega church in our entire district. She regularly hosted lavish charity galas where she routinely drank expensive champagne with local district court judges, county commissioners, and the local chief of police. She had spent decades meticulously building a towering fortress of social and political armor. If I sued her today, she would immediately hire a team of the most ruthless, high-priced defense attorneys in the state. They would completely bury me in endless aggressive legal motions. They would deliberately drag the discovery process out for years on end. They would mercilessly character assassinate me in open court, falsely claiming I had willingly signed the loan documents to help my struggling husband and that I was just a bitter, hysterical ex-wife trying to extort them after the family business failed. I could barely afford my monthly apartment rent and my subsidized daycare fees. I absolutely could not afford to sustain a multi-year legal battle against a family with bottomless pockets and endless social connections. They would legally bleed me dry until I was completely homeless, and they would probably try to take my twins away in the process, just out of pure malicious spite. I could not fight them with the law alone. The law is simply too easily manipulated by those who can afford to purchase the narrative. I needed a fundamentally different kind of weapon. I needed a knockout blow so massive, so incredibly public, and so undeniably absolute that all of Patricia's inherited money and all of her elite church connections could not possibly save her. I needed to corner them in a bright, exposing place where their high-priced lawyers had absolutely no jurisdiction. I needed a massive audience. So I took all the downloaded documents, the offshore routing numbers, the forged digital signatures, and the trust agreements, and I locked them away securely in a bank safety deposit box. I contacted the Internal Revenue Service and agreed to a tiny monthly installment plan paid directly out of my grocery store wages, just enough to keep the federal agents from seizing my personal bank account. I swallowed my pride. I swallowed my burning rage, and I went straight back to work. I waited patiently in the shadows, slowly building my professional strength, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. Over the next few months, I focused entirely on aggressively expanding my freelance accounting business. I officially established a small independent financial consulting firm dedicated specifically to helping single mothers and divorced women untangle themselves from hidden marital debts and domestic financial abuse. I aggressively used everything Patricia and David had inadvertently taught me about the dark, deceptive side of corporate finance to help other vulnerable women survive. My professional reputation in the city quietly but steadily grew. I became known as the relentless accountant who could always find the money that cowardly husbands tried to hide offshore. I was building my own indestructible armor completely independent of the toxic family that threw me away like garbage. I just needed a loud enough platform to use it. And then, as if the universe finally decided it was time to collect on a massive, long overdue karmic debt, the perfect opportunity miraculously presented itself. I was sitting at my small kitchen table late one Thursday night, quietly reviewing a desperate client's tax file when a new email popped into my professional inbox. It was from a senior casting producer at one of the highest-rated national daytime television talk shows in the country. They were producing a highly publicized special segment focused entirely on marital financial fraud. and they were actively searching for a certified financial expert with deep personal experience to speak to millions of viewers on live national television. I stared at the bright computer screen, a slow, dangerous smile finally spreading across my face for the first time in 4 years. Patricia and David truly thought they had buried me permanently in the dark. They had absolutely no idea I was about to drag them kicking and screaming directly into the brightest, most unforgiving spotlight in America. I refused to let the heavy weight of my crushing debt destroy the fragile life I had built for my children. I took the deep, suffocating pain of my betrayal and forged it into a powerful weapon. Every single night after I put my twins Leo and Mia to sleep in their shared bedroom, I sat at my small kitchen table under a flickering overhead light. I spread out my accounting textbooks, my legal notepads, and my financial software. I drafted a comprehensive business plan for a completely new kind of consulting agency. I called the new company Phoenix Financial. I chose that name because I wanted it to symbolize the act of rising from the ashes of utter devastation, which is exactly what I had been forced to do. I started incredibly small. I reached out to local domestic violence shelters and community centers, offering my professional services as a forensic accountant entirely free of charge. I sat in quiet, windowless rooms and listened to the stories of women who had been financially decimated by their manipulative husbands. These women came to me with destroyed credit scores, hidden marital assets, and court orders stating there was absolutely no money left to claim. I looked into their exhausted, tear-filled eyes, and I saw my own reflection staring right back at me. I knew exactly how terrified they felt. I held their hands, and I made them a very specific promise. I told them that money never truly disappears because it always leaves a permanent digital footprint. You simply have to possess the patience and the skill to overturn the right stones. And I overturned every single stone. I spent countless hours tracking down hidden brokerage accounts, unmasking offshore shell companies, and completely restoring their financial dignity. When we went to court, my meticulously documented forensic reports left the opposing lawyers absolutely speechless. I helped these women reclaim their stolen lives, and with every victory, I felt a small piece of my own broken soul begin to heal. Word of my success spread rapidly through the legal community. Soon, highly respected family law attorneys across the city were referring their most complex high-net-worth divorce cases directly to my firm. Phoenix Financial rapidly outgrew my tiny kitchen table. I leased a beautiful office space in downtown Chicago, hired a small staff of dedicated financial analysts, and completely left my grueling night shifts at the grocery store behind forever. I was no longer the frightened, abandoned girl crying alone in a hospital recovery room. I had transformed myself into a recognized leading expert in uncovering marital financial fraud. I was regularly invited to speak at prominent legal seminars and financial conferences. I was generating a substantial income, and I was making a profound, measurable difference in the world. But no matter how much success I achieved, no matter how many desperate women I helped, save the dark, unresolved shadow of my own personal injustice continued to burn intensely in the back of my mind. While I was very publicly building a stellar reputation for my consulting firm, I was privately building a completely different kind of case. I knew from the very beginning that taking down Patricia Vance and my cowardly husband David would require far more than just the forged commercial loan document. Patricia was heavily insulated by her massive inherited wealth and her elite high society connections. She was a master manipulator who had spent decades meticulously constructing an impenetrable fortress of social and political armor. She served as the esteemed president of the most prestigious women's charity in our district. She regularly hosted lavish catering events for local politicians, district court judges, and influential community leaders. If I simply walked into a police station and handed a detective my story, her expensive defense attorneys would immediately twist the narrative. They would bury me in endless expensive litigation and paint me as a bitter, hysterical ex-wife. I needed overwhelming, indisputable leverage. I needed to find a trail of corruption so incredibly massive that not even her powerful friends could possibly protect her. I took a significant portion of my growing business profits and quietly hired a highly specialized private investigator. His name was Robert, and he was a retired federal agent who specialized exclusively in untangling complex white-collar crime. Robert and I worked together in absolute secrecy, meeting only in quiet coffee shops on the outskirts of the city. For 8 grueling months, we meticulously tracked every single dollar that had flowed in and out of the Vance family financial accounts over the past decade. Robert handled the physical surveillance, the acquisition of public banking records, and the corporate filings, while I applied my extensive forensic accounting skills to the raw data he legally procured. What we ultimately uncovered, hidden deep within the ledgers, went far beyond a single fraudulent business loan. We unmasked a staggering, undeniable pattern of systemic financial corruption. Patricia was not just a cruel and manipulative mother-in-law. She was a highly prolific white-collar criminal operating entirely in the shadows. Through Robert's investigation, I obtained the detailed public tax filings for her real estate development company from the years leading up to its sudden bankruptcy. I carefully compared those official filings against the actual vendor payment disbursements we had managed to trace. I found massive glaring discrepancies. Patricia had been systematically evading federal corporate taxes for nearly a decade by funneling millions of dollars of company profits through a highly complex web of fake consulting firms, registered in states with relaxed corporate transparency laws. But the most sickening discovery we made had absolutely nothing to do with her real estate business. It had everything to do with her beloved charity work. Patricia proudly served as the president of the Oak Haven Women's Relief Fund, an organization that was supposedly dedicated to providing emergency housing and financial assistance to struggling single mothers. The absolute hypocrisy of her position made my blood boil with a rage I had never felt before. While I was working 3 exhausting jobs and sacrificing sleep just to buy basic baby formula for her own abandoned grandchildren, Patricia was standing on brightly lit stages in expensive designer gowns, accepting rounds of applause for her outstanding philanthropic dedication. I dug deeply into the charity's public financial disclosures. It took me weeks of late nights cross-referencing board member activities and event expenditures. Finally, the numbers revealed their incredibly dark secret. Patricia was actively siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the charity's primary operating fund. She was creating highly detailed fake invoices for event catering venue rentals and floral arrangements, approving the payments herself as the board president and routing the stolen funds directly into the exact same offshore trust account she had created for David in the Cayman Islands. She was literally stealing emergency money meant for destitute women and children to fully fund her son's luxurious tropical escape from his own parental responsibilities. The sheer audacity of her crimes was almost difficult to comprehend, but it provided me with the exact ammunition I so desperately needed. I had the offshore bank routing numbers. I had the fake vendor invoices from the charity. I had the undeniable mathematical proof of her massive federal tax evasion and her ongoing charity embezzlement. It was an absolutely ironclad case. It was a guaranteed federal indictment neatly wrapped in a meticulously documented package. Robert asked me if I was ready to take our massive file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told him we could not do that just yet. I knew exactly how Patricia operated. I knew that if we simply handed the evidence over quietly, she would immediately launch a massive public relations campaign to control the damage. She would falsely claim ignorance. She would blame her external accountants, her administrative assistants, or her naive board of directors. I needed her to be so entirely and publicly exposed that she could never hide behind her elite social mask ever again. I needed the unforgiving court of public opinion to completely trap her long before the actual court of law could even issue a formal arrest warrant. I needed the perfect stage to execute my final strike. I carefully gathered all the documents Robert and I had compiled. I printed the forged loan origination forms showing the exact timestamp of my emergency surgery. I printed the offshore wire transfer confirmations that proved David was living off stolen charity funds. I organized every single piece of paper into a series of highly secure tamper-proof binders. I created multiple digital backups, storing them on encrypted drives hidden in safe deposit boxes across the city. As an accountant, I knew that evidence was only as powerful as its preservation. I spent hours rehearsing my findings, ensuring that I could explain complex financial fraud in a way that any ordinary person could easily understand. I was preparing for the most important presentation of my entire professional career, Every single moment of pain and exhaustion I had endured over the last 4 years was being channeled into this one singular purpose. Patricia had built a grand, beautiful illusion of wealth and charity to mask her absolute cruelty. She had convinced an entire city that she was a savior while she acted as a predator. But numbers do not care about social status, and numbers do not lie. Then on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, a thick premium cream-colored envelope arrived in my corporate mailbox. The return address on the back of the envelope was beautifully embossed with shimmering gold foil. It was a formal official invitation to the annual Oak Haven Charity Gala. I opened the heavy paper and read the enclosed card. The elegant black calligraphy stated that the upcoming evening would feature a very special presentation honoring Patricia Vance for her decade of selfless dedication to women and children in need. I sat at my large mahogany desk and stared at those golden letters, a cold, calculating smile slowly forming on my face. The sheer arrogance of her sending an invitation to my office was astounding. They had absolutely no idea who they had sent this invitation to. They clearly assumed I was still the broken, invisible, and easily intimidated girl they had casually discarded at the hospital 4 years ago. They thought sending me a ticket to their elite gathering was a way to quietly mock my past struggles. I was not going to attend that glamorous gala to cause a scene. I had no intention of throwing a drink in Patricia's face or screaming at her across a crowded ballroom filled with wealthy donors. That kind of dramatic confrontation was entirely beneath me now. I was going to use their most celebrated and heavily publicized night of the entire year to perfectly execute my final strategy. I was going to use the gala to deliver a sharp, inescapable weapon directly into the hands of the television station producers who had just offered me a national platform to tell my story. I gently placed the golden invitation back into its envelope, knowing my victory was finally within reach. The trajectory of my entire life shifted because of a woman named Clara. Clara was a highly successful television actress, a household name, who portrayed strong, independent women on screen. But behind closed doors, her reality was a terrifying nightmare of financial abuse. Her husband, a charming investment banker, had spent a decade systematically draining her massive earnings. He had funneled her acting royalties into a labyrinth of offshore accounts and complicated corporate trusts, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a hollowed-out checking account and mountains of manufactured debt. When Clara finally found the courage to leave him, her high-priced divorce attorneys told her the money was simply gone. They told her she would have to start over from scratch. But Clara refused to accept that answer. Someone in the Chicago legal community gave her my private office number. She walked into Phoenix Financial wearing dark sunglasses and a heavy coat, terrified and completely broken. I sat across from her, poured her a cup of hot tea, and made her the exact same promise I made every single woman who walked through my doors. I told her that money never vanishes into thin air. It always leaves a paper trail. I took her case and worked relentlessly for 3 straight months. I applied every single forensic accounting technique I had perfected while untangling Patricia and David's fraudulent empire. I mapped out the digital footprint of every royalty check Clara had ever earned. I cracked open the shell companies her husband had established in Nevada and Wyoming. I traced the stolen funds directly to a series of hidden real estate investments in Europe. When we finally went to court, I handed Clara's legal team a comprehensive bulletproof forensic ledger that left her husband's defense attorneys completely paralyzed. The judge ordered the immediate freezing and repatriation of over $4 million in stolen assets. We won a historic settlement. Clara got her life back, and her gratitude was absolutely boundless. A few weeks later, Clara sat down for a highly publicized interview with a major national magazine. When the reporter asked how she managed to reclaim her stolen fortune, Clara did not credit her famous lawyers. She credited a fiercely dedicated forensic accountant in Chicago named Sarah. She told the world that Phoenix Financial had saved her life. That single interview catapulted my small consulting firm into the national spotlight. My office phone began ringing constantly, and then the ultimate opportunity arrived. A senior casting producer from the highest-rated daytime television talk show in America called me directly. The show was hosted by a brilliant, hard-hitting journalist named Kelly, known for tackling complex social issues with absolute fearlessness. The producer explained that they were organizing a special hour-long broadcast focused entirely on the hidden epidemic of financial deception in marriage. They wanted to expose how wealthy, manipulative families use corporate loopholes to destroy their vulnerable spouses. They had read Clara's interview, and they wanted me to serve as their premier expert guest. They wanted me to sit on stage and explain to millions of American women exactly how to spot the red flags of financial abuse. I agreed immediately. I knew with absolute certainty that this was the exact weapon I had been waiting for. I was going to use their massive, brightly lit national stage to execute a trap so perfectly designed that Patricia and David would never be able to escape it. While the television producers booked my first-class flight to New York and arranged my hotel accommodations, I was busy preparing my arsenal. I retreated to my secure office late at night, locking the door and pulling out the massive digital files my private investigator Robert had compiled over the past 8 months. I needed something far more dramatic than just tax returns and bank routing numbers. Television audiences require a compelling emotional narrative. They need to see the pure, unadulterated evil behind the financial crimes. And thanks to Robert's relentless digging into the deep digital archives of Patricia's real estate company, I had exactly what I needed. During his investigation, Robert had managed to recover a series of deleted draft documents from a heavily encrypted cloud server Patricia used back in 2010. Among the forged loan guarantees and the fake charity invoices, he had found something so deeply sinister, it made my blood run completely cold. It was a drafted letter written entirely in the first person, mimicking my exact tone and vocabulary. It was a fake suicide note. Patricia had meticulously typed it out just weeks before I gave birth to the twins. In this fabricated letter, the fake version of me confessed to being completely overwhelmed by the crushing financial debt of the $250,000 commercial loan I had supposedly taken out. The fake letter detailed my severe postpartum depression, my immense guilt for ruining the family business, and my tragic decision to end my own life to spare David and the babies any further burden. Patricia had planned for every possible contingency. If I had ever discovered the massive federal tax fraud, or if I had ever tried to take my twins and run to the authorities, she was fully prepared to have me eliminated. She would have planted that forged note, making my death look like a tragic suicide driven by financial despair. David would have been hailed as a grieving, heroic single father. Patricia would have gained total control of my children, and my name would have been permanently disgraced. The sheer calculating malice of that document was breathtaking. I printed the recovered digital draft of the fake suicide note. I gathered the undeniable forensic proof that Patricia had forged my electronic signature on the corporate loan documents while I was comatose on the operating table. I included the verified offshore bank routing numbers that proved David was currently living entirely off of stolen charity funds meant for destitute women. I placed every single piece of this explosive evidence into a heavy black secure lockbox. I sealed the box with tamper-evident tape. 2 days before I flew to New York for the live broadcast, I shipped the sealed box directly to Kelly, the talk show host, via a bonded courier. I included a very specific set of instructions. I told her producers that the box contained exclusive, never-before-seen documentary evidence of one of the most ruthless cases of domestic financial framing in American history. I explicitly instructed Kelly not to break the seal until we were broadcasting live on national television. I promised them a television moment that would absolutely shatter their ratings records. The producers, hungry for spectacular, unscripted drama, eagerly agreed to my terms. The morning of the live broadcast arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky over Manhattan. I walked into the massive television studio feeling an incredible sense of calm. I was not nervous. The frightened, exhausted girl who used to cry herself to sleep after working the night shift at the grocery store was entirely gone. As I sat in the makeup chair, watching the stylist apply a bold red lipstick and perfectly smooth my hair, I looked at my reflection and recognized the powerful, independent woman I had fought so fiercely to become. I wore a tailored emerald green suit that commanded absolute respect. I looked radiant, wealthy, and completely untouchable. Kelly stopped by my green room 15 minutes before we went live. She was holding the heavy black lockbox, her eyes shining with intense journalistic curiosity. She asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to do this on live television. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her I had been waiting 4 grueling years for this exact moment. 1,000 miles away in a wealthy, heavily guarded suburb of Chicago, the morning was unfolding very differently. David was sitting alone in the cavernous, immaculate living room of his mother's sprawling million-dollar mansion. The house was decorated with expensive antique furniture, Persian rugs and massive crystal chandeliers. It looked like a palace, but for David, it had become an unbearable, suffocating prison. When he walked out of that hospital room 4 years ago, carrying his black travel bag and his one-way ticket, he believed he was escaping to a life of endless luxury and absolute freedom. But the reality of relying entirely on a toxic, controlling mother had quickly destroyed him. Patricia controlled every single aspect of his miserable existence. The offshore trust account in the Cayman Islands was technically in his name, but Patricia held the sole administrative keys. She dictated his monthly allowance. She monitored his credit card spending. She even controlled who he was allowed to date, ensuring no woman would ever threaten her absolute dominance over him again. David had no actual career. His title at the family real estate company was entirely meaningless, especially now that the business had been quietly dissolved in bankruptcy court. He spent his days wandering aimlessly through the massive house, drinking expensive scotch before noon, and trying to ignore the gnawing heavy guilt that constantly chewed at his conscience. He had traded his wife and his beautiful twin babies for a lifetime of subservience to a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a useful pawn. He was 33 years old, fundamentally useless, and entirely trapped. He had not heard a single word from me in 4 years. Patricia had proudly assured him that I was likely living in a miserable, roach-infested trailer park. Crushed by the massive federal tax debt they had successfully pinned on my social security number. He believed her because it was much easier than facing the horrific reality of what he had done. On this particular morning, David poured himself a glass of whiskey, sank heavily into the custom leather sofa, and picked up the television remote. Patricia was out for her weekly luxury spa appointment, leaving him entirely alone with his mounting regrets. He was deeply bored, desperate for any distraction from the crushing silence of the mansion. He flipped aimlessly through the premium cable channels, passing by news broadcasts and cooking segments. He landed on the nation's most popular daytime talk show just as the dramatic opening music began to play. The camera panned across a massive, cheering studio audience before zooming in on the host Kelly, who was holding a mysterious black lockbox on her desk. David took a slow sip of his drink, barely paying attention to the screen. Then the camera dramatically cut to the premier expert guest sitting gracefully in the chair opposite the host. The studio lights blazed down, perfectly illuminating the guest. David froze. His hand began to tremble so violently that the heavy crystal whiskey glass slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the priceless Persian rug and shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The amber liquid seeped slowly into the expensive fabric, but David did not even blink. He could not breathe. He was completely paralyzed, staring at the massive high-definition television screen in absolute mind-numbing shock. Staring back at him, filling the screen with an aura of undeniable power, spectacular wealth, and fierce, unyielding confidence was the face of the wife he had abandoned to die in a hospital recovery room 4 years ago. I was not broken. I was not destroyed. I was magnificent. And as I smiled directly into the camera lens, looking straight into the homes of millions of Americans, David realized with absolute horrifying certainty that his mother's carefully constructed empire was about to be burned to the ground. The television studio was freezing, but my hands were perfectly warm. I sat in a sleek white leather chair opposite Kelly. She was a veteran journalist, known for her piercing blue eyes and her absolute refusal to let anyone dodge a difficult question. The live audience was seated in a steep semicircle around us. The red light on the primary camera blinked on, signaling that we were broadcasting live to millions of homes across America. Kelly introduced me not as a tragic victim, but as a triumphant survivor and a leading forensic accountant. She asked me to take the audience back to the very beginning. She asked me to explain how a financial expert could be so thoroughly deceived by her own family. I looked directly into the camera lens. I pictured David sitting in his mother's opulent living room, and I began to speak. I told the millions of viewers about the sterile hospital room, I described the heavy physical pain of my emergency surgery and the terrifying vulnerability of holding two premature newborn babies in my arms. I painted a vivid picture of my mother-in-law, Patricia, walking into that recovery room wearing a flawless designer suit, holding a black leather travel bag and a one-way plane ticket. I repeated the exact words she had whispered to my husband. "Go now, David. Go before this burden ruins your future at the family business." A collective gasp echoed through the television studio. The live audience was completely silent for a moment before a low murmur of absolute outrage began to ripple through the crowd. Kelly leaned forward, resting her elbows on her glass desk. Her expression was a mixture of profound empathy and fierce journalistic anger. She asked me what my husband did in that moment. I did not blink. I told the nation that he took the bag. I told them that he turned his back on his newborn son and daughter and walked out the door without looking back. Several women in the studio audience brought their hands to their mouths in pure shock. I could feel the heavy emotional weight of the room shifting entirely in my favor. But I was not finished. The emotional betrayal was only the prologue to the actual crime. Hundreds of miles away in a sprawling suburban Chicago mansion, the reality of my words was hitting its target with the force of a freight train. David sat frozen on his mother's custom Italian leather sofa. The shattered pieces of his crystal whiskey glass lay scattered across the expensive Persian rug at his feet, but he did not even notice. He was completely captivated by the massive television screen. For 4 long years, his mother Patricia had fed him a very specific, carefully constructed narrative. She had told him that shortly after he left the hospital, I had completely drained their joint bank accounts and demanded a massive cash settlement to keep quiet. She told him I had extorted her for hundreds of thousands of dollars. She explicitly promised him that I had taken the twins and run away with a wealthy lover I met at my accounting firm, refusing to let him ever see his children again. She even produced fake emails to prove her completely fabricated story. David had desperately wanted to believe her lies because believing them completely absolved him of his own immense guilt. It was much easier to play the role of the tragically wronged father than to admit he had abandoned his family when they needed him the most. But looking at my face on the television screen, seeing my absolute composure, and hearing the undeniable ring of truth in my voice, the fragile foundation of his entire reality began to violently tremble. Then Kelly asked me the question that would finally shatter his world completely. She asked how I managed to survive financially after being left so entirely destitute. I looked back into the camera and I laid out the meticulous accounting trap Patricia had set. I told the audience that 3 days after my surgery, when I tried to pay my medical bills, I discovered my joint savings had been completely drained. I explained how I worked 3 exhausting jobs for 4 years, averaging 4 hours of sleep a night just to buy basic baby formula. And then I delivered the massive crushing blow. I explained that while I was comatose on the operating table, my mother-in-law had used my personal laptop to digitally forge my signature on a $250,000 commercial loan to save her failing real estate company. On the television screen, I clearly stated the total amount of the federal tax lien that had been securely fastened to my social security number. $312,450. David stopped breathing, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. $250,000. He had absolutely no idea. Patricia had never mentioned a commercial loan. She had never mentioned a federal tax lien. She had told him the family business simply folded due to a changing economic market, and that she had luckily secured his future through a long-standing international family trust. The staggering realization of what she had actually done to the mother of his children began to suffocate him. He was suddenly drowning in the horrifying truth that his entire life of luxury was directly funded by my absolute financial ruin. At that exact moment, the heavy mahogany front door of the mansion swung open. Patricia walked into the grand foyer holding several shopping bags from a high-end boutique. She was humming a quiet tune, fresh from her luxury spa appointment, completely oblivious to the explosive detonation occurring in her own living room. She set her designer handbag on the console table and walked into the living room, complaining about the terrible traffic on the interstate. Then she heard my voice. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted to the massive flat-screen television mounted above the marble fireplace. She saw my face. She heard me explaining the intricate forensic accounting methods I had used to trace the stolen loan funds through a Delaware shell company directly into an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. Patricia's elegant, poised demeanor vanished in an instant. Pure, unadulterated panic flashed across her meticulously lifted face. She dropped her shopping bags, letting them spill across the polished hardwood floor. She lunged forward with surprising speed, scrambling desperately across the room toward the coffee table where the television remote control was resting. "Turn it off," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw terror. "Turn it off right now, David. She is lying. She is a hysterical liar trying to extort us again." She reached for the remote, but she never made it. David shot up from the sofa. For the first time in his entire miserable 33 years of existence, he did not submit to his mother's commanding tone. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip so incredibly tight that Patricia actually gasped in pain. "Let go of me," Patricia demanded, struggling to pull her arm away. "I said turn that garbage off. She's making all of this up to destroy our reputation. You know she ran away with that man." David did not let go. He looked down at the woman who had controlled every single decision he had ever made. He looked at the woman who had convinced him to abandon his own newborn babies. He looked at the mother who had sworn to him that I was a greedy, manipulative monster. "She is not asking for money," Mother David said, his voice shaking with a dangerous, newly discovered rage. "She is an accountant on national television, explaining exactly how you forged her signature. Did you do it? Did you take out a massive corporate loan in her name while she was bleeding in surgery?" Patricia tried to yank her arm free again, her eyes wide and wild. "Do not be ridiculous, David. She is a vindictive, crazy woman. You know what she's like. You know what she did to us. Now let go of my hand and turn off that television." "I am not turning it off," David said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. "I am going to listen to every single word she has to say, and you are going to stand right here and listen with me." He forced Patricia to turn back toward the television screen, keeping a firm iron grip on her wrist. Patricia was trembling now, not from anger, but from the terrifying realization that she had completely lost control of her son. The invisible puppet strings she had used to manipulate him for his entire life had just been violently severed. Back in the brightly lit television studio, I could not see the epic confrontation unfolding in that Chicago mansion, but I could feel the absolute power of the moment shifting. The live audience was completely captivated, hanging onto my every word. I had just outlined the exact financial path of the stolen money, but I had deliberately held back the most devastating piece of evidence. I had saved the absolute best for last. Kelly, the talk show host, leaned forward and looked directly into the primary camera. Her expression was solemn, and her voice carried the heavy, dramatic weight of a seasoned journalist who knew she was about to make television history. "Sarah," she said, turning her piercing blue eyes back to me, "what you have just described is a horrific systematic case of financial abuse and domestic betrayal. But as staggering as this financial crime is, there is a deeper layer of cruelty to this story that goes far beyond stolen money." Kelly reached down under her glass desk. The studio grew so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the massive lighting rig suspended from the ceiling. When she brought her hands back up, she was holding the heavy black secure lockbox I had shipped to her 2 days earlier. The tamper-evident tape was still perfectly intact across the metal seam. She placed the box precisely in the center of the desk so the cameras could capture it clearly. "You sent this box to our producers under very strict instructions," Kelly continued, her voice echoing through the silent room. "You told us that it contained documentary evidence of something so profoundly disturbing that it would change the entire context of this investigation. You asked me not to break this seal until we were broadcasting live to the nation." I nodded, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. "Yes, Kelly, that is correct." Kelly picked up a small silver letter opener from her desk. She sliced cleanly through the tamper-evident tape and popped the metal latches on the lockbox. She reached inside and pulled out a stack of documents. She set the bank routing confirmations and the forged signature files to the side. Then she picked up a single piece of paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. It was the recovered digital draft of the fake suicide note Patricia had meticulously authored. Kelly looked down at the paper. She read the first few lines silently to herself. As her eyes moved across the page, I saw her professional composure slip for just a fraction of a second. Her breath hitched slightly, and a look of absolute sheer horror washed over her face. She looked up at the studio audience and then back at me. Sarah Kelly said, her voice trembling just enough to convey the absolute gravity of the moment. There is a detail here the audience does not know. Our independent legal team has verified the digital origins of this specific document. They have confirmed exactly when and where it was created. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes burning with fierce, righteous indignation. She was speaking to the millions of people watching at home, but I knew her words were striking one specific woman in a mansion 1,000 miles away, like a physical blow. Sarah, there is a detail the audience does not know, Kelly repeated, holding the document up for the cameras to capture. Our legal team has verified this document. Kelly carefully placed the horrifying digital draft of the fake suicide note down on her sleek glass desk. The studio was so incredibly quiet that the soft hum of the heavy broadcast cameras, shifting on their mechanical pedestals, echoed clearly across the room. The live audience was completely paralyzed, staring at the stage in absolute stunned silence. But Kelly was not finished. She reached her hand back into the tamper-evident lockbox and slowly withdrew one final document. It was a single sheet of paper printed securely inside a clear protective sleeve. She looked up at the audience, her piercing blue eyes conveying the heavy, somber weight of a seasoned journalist who knew she was holding the ultimate piece of undeniable truth. Kelly explained to the millions of people watching at home that my private investigator had legally obtained this specific file during the massive discovery phase of Patricia's corporate bankruptcy proceedings. It was an internal memorandum, a highly confidential email sent directly from Patricia to her personal estate and corporate attorney just 3 weeks before my twin babies were born. Kelly held the paper up to the bright studio lights. She took a deep breath, adjusting her posture, and began to read the memo aloud to the entire nation. She read Patricia's exact words with a cold, clear precision. We must isolate David completely from his wife. We must keep the offshore trust entirely under my strict administrative control to force him to obey my directives. We will use Sarah's name and her digital credentials to completely cover the massive federal tax debt we have accumulated. Do not let David know about this debt under any circumstances. He is far too weak and sentimental to handle the truth. Once the children are born, we will execute the exit strategy immediately. Sarah will be left to absorb the total financial collapse, and David will have no choice but to return home and remain permanently dependent on me. Kelly paused, letting the sheer unadulterated malice of those words hang heavily in the brightly lit television studio. She looked over at me sitting in the guest chair. I simply nodded my head, verifying to the world that every single syllable she had just read was the absolute undeniable truth. A collective, horrified gasp finally broke the silence in the studio. Several women in the front row of the audience brought their hands to their mouths in pure shock. I heard someone whisper that it was pure evil. I sat perfectly still in my emerald green suit, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I did not shed a single tear. I had shed all of my tears 4 years ago, on the cold linoleum floor of a hospital maternity ward. Today I was not here to cry. I was here to watch the powerful fortress of my abusers burn to the ground. 1,000 miles away, inside a sprawling, impeccably decorated mansion in the wealthiest suburb of Chicago, the reality of my words was hitting its target with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The heavy silence in Patricia's opulent living room was deafening. David stood completely frozen in the center of the Persian rug, his hand still wrapped tightly around his mother's wrist. The shattered pieces of his expensive crystal whiskey glass lay scattered across the floor, the amber liquid seeping into the wool fibers, but he did not even look down. His eyes were locked on the massive high-definition television screen mounted above the marble fireplace. The words from the television broadcast echoed relentlessly off the high-vaulted ceilings. We must isolate David. Force him to obey my directives. He is too weak to handle the truth. David slowly turned his head to look at his mother. This was the woman who had promised him absolute freedom. This was the woman who had spent the last 4 years sitting across from him at the dining table, sipping expensive wine and convincing him that I was a manipulative, greedy monster. She had told him that I had extorted the family for hundreds of thousands of dollars. She had explicitly sworn to him that I had taken the twins and run away with a wealthy lover I met at my accounting firm, completely refusing to let him ever see his children again. She had even produced highly detailed fabricated emails to prove her fake story. David had desperately wanted to believe her lies, because believing them completely absolved him of his own immense guilt. It was so much easier to play the role of the tragically wronged, heartbroken father than to admit to himself that he had cowardly abandoned his family when they needed him the most. But looking at Patricia now, seeing the sudden uncontrollable panic twitching in her eyes, the fragile foundation of his entire reality violently collapsed. He realized in that single horrifying moment that his mother had never been trying to protect him. She had been meticulously building a psychological prison specifically designed to turn him into a completely dependent parasitic puppet. She had engineered the entire financial disaster just to ensure he would never have the resources or the independence to leave her shadow. But the most devastating realization for David was not about his own lost autonomy. It was the crushing, suffocating truth about his children. He thought about Leo and Mia, the tiny, fragile babies he had left crying in the hospital recovery room. He thought about their small hands and their innocent faces. He finally understood that when his mother forged my signature on $250,000 federal tax debt, she fully intended for my children to starve. She had carefully engineered a plot to throw her own flesh and blood onto the freezing streets of Chicago with absolutely no financial resources, no shelter, and no father to protect them. She knew the federal government would drain my accounts and garnish my wages, leaving me completely destitute while trying to feed two premature infants. The sheer magnitude of her calculated evil washed over him, completely buckling his knees. He dropped Patricia's wrist and stumbled backward. He collapsed heavily onto the custom leather sofa, burying his face in his trembling hands as the unbearable weight of his unforgivable cowardice crushed the very breath from his lungs. Patricia stood in the center of her luxurious living room, utterly and completely exposed. The stoic, arrogant smile she had worn like an impenetrable iron mask for decades slowly melted away. In its place was an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the television screen, watching my calm, victorious face staring back at her. Her heart began to pound erratically against her ribs. She was a woman who had spent her entire life measuring her self-worth by her social standing, her wealth, and her absolute control over how others perceived her. Then she thought about the millions of people currently tuned into this daytime broadcast. The horrifying reality of her situation began to sink in. She realized that the wealthy corporate donors who funded her lavish charity galas were watching right now. She realized the powerful local district court judges she drank champagne with at the country club were watching. She realized that the esteemed members of her elite church council, the very people who revered her as a pillar of moral virtue and community leadership, were sitting in their homes listening to the exact words she had used to casually destroy an innocent mother and two newborn infants. Every single lie she had ever told was currently unraveling on national television. Decades of meticulously cultivated social prestige vanished into thin air in a matter of seconds. She was no longer respected as a generous, wealthy philanthropist. She was a documented, malicious predator, a white-collar criminal who stole from charities and forged financial documents to ruin her own family. The entire world now knew her true identity, and there was absolutely no amount of money or social influence that could ever buy her way out of this public execution. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she desperately looked around her beautiful, empty mansion, suddenly realizing that her grand palace had just become her permanent tomb. Back in the brightly lit television studio in New York, the audience remained perfectly still, hanging onto the heavy silence. Kelly looked at me across the glass desk, her posture respectful and attentive. She gracefully turned the floor over to me for one final statement before the broadcast ended. The primary camera smoothly tracked forward, zooming in tight on my face. I looked directly into the dark lens. I visualized Patricia standing in her ruined living room, completely stripped of her power, watching me from her television screen. My voice was completely cold, entirely devoid of any residual anger, bitterness, or sorrow. It carried only the absolute, unyielding certainty of pure justice. I told the national audience that I did not come on television today to complain about my past trauma. I said, I did not come here to seek public pity for the years I spent working 3 exhausting jobs just to buy basic necessities for my children. I did not need anyone's sympathy because I had already survived the absolute worst they could do to me, and I had emerged stronger, wealthier, and far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. I kept my eyes locked on the camera lens, knowing David was sitting on that sofa, listening to the woman he threw away. I told the audience that money never truly disappears. It always leaves a permanent digital footprint for anyone brave enough to follow it. I explained that boundaries are not just walls we build to keep toxic people out of our lives. They are the ultimate weapons we use to protect our peace, our children, and our futures. Then I leaned forward slightly, delivering my final devastating blow. I said I came here today for one specific reason. I came here to officially announce that every single document inside this lockbox, including the forged commercial loan, guarantees the highly detailed offshore bank routing numbers, the fake charity vendor invoices, and the draft of the fabricated suicide note, has already been handed over to the proper authorities. I did not blink as I delivered the final sentence. I said this entire comprehensive file has been officially submitted to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I am fully prepared to testify in federal court. The studio audience erupted into a massive, deafening standing ovation. The sound of their applause filled the room, a powerful wave of validation for the 4 years of silent, agonizing struggle I had endured. Kelly smiled warmly and thanked me for my incredible bravery as the program's dramatic exit music began to play over the studio speakers. The broadcast seamlessly faded to black, leaving my final, chilling promise echoing into millions of living rooms across the country. At that exact moment, 1,000 miles away, the heavy brass doorbell of Patricia's immaculate suburban Chicago mansion rang out with a loud, demanding, and incredibly final echo. The heavy brass doorbell of Patricia's immaculate suburban Chicago mansion rang out with a loud, demanding, and incredibly final echo. It was a sound that shattered the suffocating panic taking over her living room. Patricia stood frozen in front of her massive television screen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind racing to comprehend the absolute destruction of her carefully constructed empire. She took a shaky breath, desperately trying to compose herself. She smoothed the front of her expensive designer blouse, hoping against hope that the person standing on her front porch was just a neighbor, a delivery driver, or perhaps her high-priced defense attorney arriving to manage the crisis. She forced her signature aristocratic smile onto her face, the same fake condescending smile she had used to intimidate people for decades. But the illusion was already dead. She walked through the grand foyer, her heels clicking against the imported Italian marble floor. She reached for the heavy brass handle and pulled the door open. Patricia was completely prepared to dismiss whoever was standing there with a wave of her manicured hand. Instead, she found herself face to face with the absolute unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. Standing on her manicured front porch were not her wealthy country club friends or her loyal church council members. A team of stern-faced men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI and IRS printed across the back stood in a tight, imposing formation. Parked along the curved driveway of her luxurious estate were 4 dark, unmarked federal vehicles. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pristine white columns of her mansion, creating a harsh, terrifying strobe effect that signaled the permanent end of her reign. A tall, broad-shouldered federal agent stepped forward, holding a thick stack of official documents. He did not care about her expensive clothes, her local political connections, or her status as a prominent charity president. He looked at her with cold professional detachment. He stated her full name and held up a federal search warrant and a grand jury subpoena. He informed her that they were executing a court-ordered raid on the premises in connection with an ongoing federal investigation into aggravated identity theft, massive corporate wire fraud, and felony federal tax evasion. Patricia completely lost her ability to speak. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. She tried to block the doorway instinctively, raising her hand to stop them from entering her pristine sanctuary. She stammered out a weak, pathetic threat, claiming she was personal friends with the local district judge and the county commissioner. She demanded they wait outside until she could call her attorney. But federal agents executing a criminal search warrant do not wait for permission. The lead agent calmly but forcefully moved past her, stepping directly onto the expensive marble floor with his heavy combat boots. The rest of the team immediately flooded into the house, fanning out across the grand foyer, the formal dining room, and the custom executive home office. David, who had been sitting paralyzed on the living room sofa, stumbled out into the hallway just as the agents began systematically dismantling their fraudulent life. He watched in absolute horror as federal investigators began pulling files from his mother's mahogany cabinets, seizing laptop computers, packing away external hard drives, and placing evidence tags on the expensive artwork that had been purchased with stolen charity funds. The absolute magnitude of the situation finally crashed down on him. There was no escape. There was no secret offshore trust account that could protect them from the relentless reach of the United States federal government. The profound realization of his own impending ruin shattered the decades of psychological conditioning his mother had subjected him to. For 33 years, David had been a passive, obedient puppet, allowing Patricia to pull his strings, dictate his choices, and destroy his marriage. But watching the federal agents tear through the mansion, the crushing weight of his catastrophic cowardice violently ignited into explosive, unadulterated rage. He turned his attention fully to the woman who had orchestrated his complete destruction. He stepped toward his mother, his face twisted in a mask of absolute fury and profound despair. He began to scream at her, his voice echoing painfully off the high-vaulted ceilings of the foyer. He demanded to know how she could have possibly done this. He screamed about the $250,000 fraudulent loan she had illegally pinned on the mother of his children. He screamed about the stolen charity money. He screamed about the fact that she had callously engineered a plot that would have left his own flesh and blood, his beautiful newborn twins, to absolutely starve on the freezing streets of Chicago. He finally recognized that his mother had never loved him. She had only ever loved the absolute control she possessed over him. Patricia backed away from her son, her aristocratic facade entirely stripped away. She looked like a cornered animal. She tried to offer her usual manipulative defenses. She frantically waved her hands, pointing at the federal agents tearing through her home and crying out that she had only done it to protect their family legacy. She desperately tried to convince David that they were the real victims, that I was just a vindictive accountant who had somehow orchestrated this entire federal raid to ruin them. But her lies held absolutely no power anymore. Her voice trembled, her posture collapsed, and her prestigious high society mask shattered into a million irreparable pieces on the marble floor. She was no longer a wealthy, respected philanthropist. She was just a desperate, pathetic criminal begging her ruined son for a sliver of sympathy he no longer possessed. My private investigator, Robert, was parked in a discreet dark sedan directly across the street from the mansion. He watched the entire scene unfold through the large, illuminated bay windows of the estate. He called me from his encrypted cell phone as he watched two federal agents firmly escort Patricia out the front door, placing her carefully into the back of a dark government vehicle. When Robert described the absolute terror on her face and the chaotic destruction of her fraudulent empire, I did not feel an overwhelming surge of joy. I did not throw a celebration. I simply sat at my desk inside the beautiful downtown office of Phoenix Financial, closed my eyes, and let out a long, slow breath. A profound, deep-seated peace settled over my soul. The crushing, heavy shadow that had followed me for 4 agonizing years was finally and permanently lifted. I had protected my children. I had fought back against the monsters who tried to bury us, and I had decisively won. I thought the situation was completely resolved. I assumed David would spend the rest of his life tangled in federal litigation fighting to keep whatever meager scraps of his life he could salvage. I fully expected him to disappear into the miserable, pathetic existence he had willingly chosen when he walked out of my hospital recovery room. But I severely underestimated the sheer desperate delusion of a man who suddenly realizes he has absolutely nothing left to lose. 3 days after the massive federal raid, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a financial forensic report for a new client. The morning sun was shining brightly through the large glass windows, casting a warm, hopeful glow across my mahogany desk. My business was thriving. My twins were happy and healthy, and my life was finally perfectly secure. Then the sleek intercom on my desk buzzed loudly. It was my receptionist. Her voice sounded tight, uncertain, and slightly alarmed. She told me that a man was standing in the front lobby demanding to speak with me. She said he refused to leave and was causing a quiet but desperate scene. I asked her for his name, even though a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach already told me exactly who was standing on the other side of my office door. I stood up from my leather chair, smoothed the front of my tailored suit, and walked purposefully out of my office and into the elegant reception area of Phoenix Financial. David was standing near the glass entrance doors. He looked completely unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant golden boy of the wealthy Vance real estate empire was entirely gone. His expensive designer suit was rumpled and heavily wrinkled. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and dark, exhausted circles shadowed his face. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe burn to ashes. And in his trembling hands, he held a massive, incredibly expensive bouquet of long-stem red roses. The moment I stepped into the lobby and our eyes met, he completely broke down. Right there in the middle of my professional corporate office, in front of my receptionist and several passing financial analysts, David dropped heavily to his knees. The thud of his knees hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly in the quiet reception area. He looked up at me, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face, his shoulders shaking with loud, dramatic sobs. He held the bouquet of roses out toward me like a pathetic, useless peace offering. He completely ignored the professional setting, launching immediately into a loud, desperate theatrical display of sheer manipulation. "Sarah," he cried out, his voice cracking with artificial anguish. "Sarah, please, you have to listen to me. I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea what she was doing. My mother controlled everything. She lied to me. She told me you stole from us. She told me you ran away. She manipulated my mind and forced me to leave you at the hospital. I was a weak, terrified fool, and I have regretted walking out that door every single second of every single day for the last 4 years. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid, my expression absolutely completely devoid of any emotion. I looked down at the man kneeling on my floor crying and begging for mercy. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection. The man kneeling before me was a complete stranger. "Please, Sarah," he sobbed, dropping the roses onto the floor and reaching out to grasp the hem of my suit jacket. I stepped back quickly, refusing to let him touch me. He pulled his hands back to his chest, pressing them together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "I have lost everything. The federal agents seized the offshore accounts. The government froze all the remaining assets. I am completely broke. I have no home, no job, and no family. I was a victim of her abuse too. Please, just give me one more chance to make this right. I want to be a husband to you again. I want to be a real father to Leo and Mia. Please just let me see my children. I am begging you to let me see my son and daughter." He knelt there, weeping loudly, performing the perfect charade of the deeply repentant, heartbroken father seeking redemption. He thought his tears would somehow erase the 4 years of silent, agonizing struggle I had endured. He thought a bouquet of red roses would suddenly magically absolve him of the fact that he willingly left his newborn premature babies to starve while he lived in luxurious offshore comfort. He actually believed that because his wealthy mother had finally been arrested, I would somehow welcome him back into the safe, successful, beautiful life I had built entirely without him. I stared down at him, watching him play the victim, and I realized that the final lingering conflict of my past had just walked directly into my present. But this time, I was not a helpless, bleeding girl in a hospital bed. I was the architect of my own destiny. I looked down at the man kneeling on the hardwood floor of my reception area. 4 years ago, the sight of David crying would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. I would have dropped to my knees beside him, pulled him into my arms, and done everything in my power to fix whatever was hurting him. But standing there, in my tailored suit, surrounded by the successful agency I had built from absolute scratch, I felt nothing remotely resembling love. I did not even feel hatred. Hatred requires energy and passion. Hatred means you still care. Looking at his tear-stained face and the discarded red roses scattered across the floor, I felt only a profound, distant pity. He was a hollow, empty vessel of a man who had never possessed the courage to think for himself. I calmly told him to stand up. I kept my voice low and steady, ensuring my tone carried absolutely no emotional warmth. The financial analysts and my receptionist watched in stunned silence as David slowly dragged himself up from the floor. He wiped his nose with the back of his trembling hand, still looking at me with those desperate, bloodshot eyes. He started rambling again, making endless, pathetic excuses. He blamed his mother for everything. He claimed she had brainwashed him and hidden the truth. He begged me to remember the early days of our marriage. He begged me to let him see Leo and Mia, assuring me he was ready to be the father they deserved. I let him speak until he completely ran out of words. The silence in the lobby was heavy and absolute. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him that he was incredibly foolish to think he could walk back into my life just because the wealthy protective bubble his mother had built for him had finally popped. I told him he did not miss his family. He missed his comfort. He was only standing in my office because he had nowhere else to go. And he was desperately looking for a new woman to solve his problems and carry his dead weight. David shook his head vehemently, taking a step closer to me. He insisted that he truly loved our children and that he had a legal right as their father to see them. He demanded visitation rights, claiming no court in the country would keep a remorseful father away from his twin babies. I actually smiled a cold, humorless smile. I asked him to wait right there in the lobby. I turned around and walked back into my corner office. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk and pulled out a single thin manila folder. It was a file I had kept safely secured for 4 years, waiting for the very unlikely day he ever tried to return. I walked back out to the reception area and handed the closed folder to him. David took the folder with shaking hands. He opened it and stared blankly at the legal document inside. His eyes darted across the dense legal paragraphs, clearly struggling to comprehend the complex legal terminology. I decided to explain it to him in very simple, unmistakable terms. I told him to look closely at the signature on the very last page. I reminded him about the hasty, quiet divorce his mother had orchestrated immediately after he abandoned me at the hospital. I reminded him that Patricia had shoved a massive stack of legal papers in front of him and told him to sign everything quickly so he could be entirely free of my financial mess. I asked him if he had actually read a single page of those documents before putting his pen to the paper. The color completely drained from his face as the realization hit him. The document he was holding was a voluntary, irrevocable termination of parental rights. Patricia had explicitly arranged it to ensure that the state could never force David to pay a single penny of child support for the twins. She wanted to absolutely guarantee that my crushing fabricated debt and my children would never legally touch her precious son. David had blindly signed away every single legal claim to Leo and Mia on that very first day. He was no longer their father in the eyes of the law. He was nothing but a biological stranger. I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him he chose to listen to his mother the night his children needed him the most. I told him he chose his own comfort over their survival. Now he had to live with that choice for the rest of his miserable life. I firmly instructed him to leave my office and never approach me or my children ever again. I told him if he ever came near us, I would have him arrested for harassment. David stood completely frozen, clutching the document that finalized his absolute failure. He looked at the discarded roses on the floor, turned around, and walked out of the glass doors, disappearing into the busy city streets. That was the last time I ever saw him. The federal justice system does not move quickly, but when it finally strikes, it strikes with absolute devastating finality. Over the next several months, I watched from a safe, comfortable distance as Patricia Vance's elite aristocratic world was completely dismantled piece by piece. The federal prosecutors built an impenetrable case against her, utilizing every single piece of forensic evidence my private investigator and I had provided. Her high-priced defense attorneys tried desperately to negotiate a plea deal, but the sheer volume and malicious nature of her crimes made leniency completely impossible. The local news channels covered the scandal relentlessly. The entire city watched as the prominent, wealthy socialite was dragged through the criminal courts. Patricia was formally expelled from her prestigious country club. She was completely ostracized by her wealthy friends who were terrified of being associated with her toxic public image. The board of directors at the Oak Haven Women's Relief Fund immediately stripped her of her presidency and publicly condemned her horrific actions. The very people she used to drink expensive champagne with now crossed the street just to avoid making eye contact with her. The final judgment was absolute. Patricia was convicted of multiple counts of massive wire fraud felony, federal tax evasion, and aggravated identity theft. The federal judge showed her absolutely zero mercy, sentencing her to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, the Internal Revenue Service moved swiftly to seize and liquidate every single asset she possessed. Her sprawling million-dollar mansion, her expensive luxury vehicles, her antique furniture, and her extensive jewelry collection were all auctioned off to satisfy the massive federal debts she had accrued. She was left with absolutely nothing. The woman who had proudly sneered at me and called my precious children a burden was now wearing a coarse prison uniform, stripped of her wealth, her freedom, and her false dignity. David suffered a completely different kind of punishment. Without his mother's deep pockets to protect him, and without the stolen offshore trust account to fund his luxurious lifestyle, he fell rapidly into absolute poverty. He had spent his entire adult life relying on Patricia's wealth, completely failing to develop any actual professional skills or personal resilience. The real estate market had no use for a pampered former executive whose only qualification was his last name. I heard through old mutual acquaintances that he eventually found a minimum wage job working the night shift at a local hardware store. It was incredibly poetic justice, considering the years I spent breaking my back on the night shift just to survive the financial ruin he helped inflict upon me. David moved into a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. He spent his days sitting in a cramped, dingy room, staring at the peeling wallpaper, completely consumed by the heavy, agonizing regret of his own cowardly choices. He had traded a beautiful, loving family for a temporary illusion of freedom, and now he had to spend the rest of his solitary existence living with the ghosts of the children he willingly threw away. As for me, I built a life that is more beautiful and secure than I ever could have imagined. Phoenix Financial continues to grow, helping countless vulnerable women escape the dark, terrifying shadows of domestic financial abuse. I employ a full staff of dedicated professionals who share my fierce commitment to truth and justice. We overturn the stones, we find the hidden money, and we give victims the tools they need to reclaim their stolen lives. My work fills my days with immense purpose, and my nights are no longer consumed by fear and anxiety. Leo and Mia are now bright, happy, and incredibly energetic 4-year-old children. They run through our spacious, warm home with absolute joy, completely unaware of the dark storm that surrounded their birth. They will never know the feeling of financial insecurity. They will never know the deep, aching pain of conditional love. They are surrounded by genuine warmth, protection, and absolute unwavering devotion. When I look at them, I do not see the painful legacy of their biological father. I see the incredible strength and the boundless resilience that carried us through the darkest period of our lives. I learned a very profound lesson through these last 4 years. We are often taught that we must endlessly sacrifice ourselves for the sake of family unity. We are told to shrink our needs, ignore our boundaries, and quietly endure disrespect just to keep the peace. But love is not supposed to be a tool for exploitation. True family does not force you to carry their toxic burdens while they stand by and watch you drown. You cannot save people who are actively trying to destroy you. You have an absolute fundamental right to protect your peace. You have the right to set hard, unbreakable boundaries against people who view your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. It does not matter if those people share your blood. It does not matter if they are your in-laws, your parents, or your spouse. If someone continuously chooses to harm you, betray you, or manipulate your reality, you owe them absolutely nothing. Walking away from toxic, abusive people is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It requires an immense amount of courage to look at the people who are supposed to protect you and realize that you must protect yourself from them instead. But once you take that step, once you finally refuse to accept the false narratives and the cruel manipulation, you open the door to a life of incredible, authentic freedom. I found my freedom, and I hope with all my heart that every single person watching this finds theirs too. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to my story until the very end. If you have ever experienced betrayal, or if you have had to set difficult boundaries to protect yourself and your children, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. It really helps these important stories reach the people who desperately need to hear them. I want to know where you are joining from today, so please drop a comment with your location and the time you are watching this video. Let us continue to support each other and build a strong community of survivors. Remember that your worth is never defined by the people who failed to see it. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story. The late afternoon sun casts a warm golden glow across the thick green grass of my backyard. I am sitting on a wide wooden porch that I sanded and stained with my own 2 hands just last month. A gentle breeze blows through the large oak trees lining the edge of the property, bringing with it the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and the unmistakable sound of absolute pure joy. Out on the lawn, my beautiful 4-year-old twins Leo and Mia are chasing a brightly colored plastic ball. Their tiny legs carry them as fast as they can go, their laughter ringing out like a melody that completely heals every broken piece of my past. Leo trips over his own feet and tumbles softly into the grass. For a brief second, he looks surprised, but then Mia falls down right beside him and the two of them burst into a fit of uncontrollable giggles. I watch them roll in the soft grass, and a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settles deep into my bones. This backyard belongs to us. The sturdy brick house standing behind me belongs to us. There is no wealthy mother-in-law controlling the deed. There is no cowardly husband holding the threat of financial ruin over my head. I bought this beautiful home entirely with my own money. Every single brick, every window, and every blade of grass was paid for by the countless hours I spent rebuilding my life from the absolute bottom. I remember the worn-out carpet in the tiny apartment I rented right after David abandoned us in the hospital. I remember the loud clanking radiator and the constant terrifying fear of how I would afford to buy their next container of formula. Now I sit on a beautiful porch, sipping hot tea and watching my children play in a fortress of security that I constructed entirely by myself. I do not need a weak man to support me. I do not need a toxic, manipulative family to validate my existence. For so many years, I genuinely believed that I needed David to make our family complete. I believed that if I just worked a little harder, accommodated his mother a little more, and kept my head down, we would eventually be happy. I was so incredibly naive. I thought his presence was necessary for my survival. But looking at my children right now, I realized that his absence was actually the greatest gift he could have ever given us. His departure cleared the path for me to discover exactly how powerful I truly am. I am the sole provider. I am the absolute protector of this family, and I am completely enough. This peace that surrounds me right now is my most precious asset. It is worth infinitely more than any offshore trust account or any massive inheritance. True peace is waking up in the morning and knowing that your world is not built on a fragile foundation of lies and manipulation. True peace is knowing that the smiles on your children's faces are genuine and that they are safe from the dark, toxic games of selfish adults. I do not spend my days looking over my shoulder anymore. I do not worry about hidden debts or sudden betrayals. I have built a transparent, honest, and incredibly secure life. The quiet moments like this, watching the sunset while my children play, are the true rewards for surviving the darkest storm of my life. I fought a brutal war against people who tried to destroy me, and this beautiful quiet evening is my ultimate absolute victory. Looking back on the agonizing journey that brought me to this peaceful porch, I have learned lessons that fundamentally changed the way I view the entire world. I want to share these lessons with you because I know there are so many of you out there who are currently walking the same dark path I once walked. For a very long time, I believed that blind love and endless sacrifice were the ultimate virtues of a good wife and a good mother. I believed that if I just loved David enough, if I just sacrificed enough of my own comfort and my own dreams, he would eventually step up and be the man I needed him to be. I was completely wrong. Blind love and endless sacrifice will never hold back a coward. You cannot love someone into being brave. You cannot sacrifice enough of yourself to magically transform a weak, selfish person into a responsible adult. When you continuously give everything you have to people who refuse to take accountability for their own lives, you do not cure their dysfunction. You simply make their dysfunction incredibly comfortable. David and Patricia took my love, my trust, and my hard work, and they weaponized it all against me. They used my dedication to our family as the perfect blind spot to orchestrate my financial ruin. I learned the hard way that giving your entire self to the wrong people is not noble. It is a slow, devastating form of self-destruction. The most important realization I had was about the absolute necessity of boundaries. For years, I thought setting boundaries was cruel or selfish. I thought saying no meant I was being a bad partner. But the strict, unforgiving boundaries I set today are the indestructible shields protecting me and my children from the cruelty of tomorrow. Boundaries are not walls meant to keep love out. They are strong, secure doors that only allow respect, honesty, and genuine care to enter your life. When I completely cut David and Patricia out of our world, I did not do it out of spite. I did it because my children deserve to grow up in an environment completely free of manipulation and deceit. My boundaries are the reason Leo and Mia can laugh so freely in the grass today. They will never know the pain of being used as pawns in a toxic family game because my boundaries stand firmly in the way. If there is one absolute truth you take away from my story, please let it be this. Never under any circumstances give control of your finances and your entire life to anyone else. It does not matter how much you love them. It does not matter how deeply you trust them or how convincing their promises sound. You must always know exactly where you stand financially. You must maintain your own resources, your own skills, and your own independent ability to survive. Financial control is the ultimate form of power in any relationship. When you hand over the keys to your financial security, you are handing over the keys to your freedom. I was a professional accountant, and I still allowed my trust in my husband to blind me to the reality of his family's corruption. I will never make that catastrophic mistake again. You are the only person who will truly look out for your best interests when the world falls apart. Guard your independence with everything you have. I know that sharing this deep personal pain is not easy, but I also know how incredibly important it is to speak the truth out loud. We are often taught to keep our family trauma a secret, to hide the ugly realities of financial abuse and domestic betrayal behind closed doors, just to protect the reputations of the people who hurt us. But silence only protects the abusers. Speaking the truth brings justice into the light. If you agree that justice always speaks up at the right time, and if my journey from a betrayed, helpless girl to a strong, independent woman resonated with your own experiences, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel to support me. I want to build a strong community of survivors here, a place where we can share our strength and remind each other that we are never alone in our struggles. I would absolutely love to hear from you directly. Please drop a comment down below and tell me exactly where you are watching from and what time you are watching this video. Let me know if you have ever had to draw a hard line to protect your own peace and your own family. I make it a point to read and connect with each and every one of you because your stories give me just as much hope as my story might give to you. We are all connected by our resilience and our refusal to let toxic people dictate the rest of our lives. Please remember, no matter how dark your current situation feels or how impossible the road ahead might seem, you are so much stronger than you think you are. You have the power to rebuild your life entirely on your own terms. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next story.